right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Trending Echoes, brought to you by Trends Research and Advisory. I'm your host, Omar, and we've got a guest that's joining us all the way from the United States, from Washington, D.C. to be specific. He is the director of the Skullcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. We have right here with us in the studio Mr. Joonathán Pankow. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So, first thing, thoughts on COP28?
Look, I think it's obviously been a tremendously successful COP for all of the criticism that was coming in. The reality is I think that the United Arab Emirates has demonstrated quite clearly that despite the long history in the oil and gas industry, that it's really looking to move beyond that in a meaningful way. And I think it's demonstrating what it's going to look like in a greener future, not just for the Middle East, but for everybody. And so from that perspective, I think it's been incredibly successful already. I expect that to continue through the end of the week. And I think that you've seen a lot of the criticism rightly die down. I think there was some initial challenges with Sultan Al Jaber. I think he's handled that well. And we'll see where it goes from here. But a successful COP, to be sure.
You're talking about Mr. Sultan. What exactly are we talking about? Was it the debate that he was having?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he had a debate, and I thought it was an interesting debate. And I think, you know, what he said is not wrong in that oil and gas fossil fuels are going to play a continuing role. The question I think that it really folks have to get to is how long that lasts and how do you eventually move away. It's going to become less of a priority, less of a critical issue. That, in other words, oil and gas, I think it's true, is not going to be sustainable at the levels it's at now, where you need to move toward a greener future, toward more alternatives, to wind, to solar, to hydrogen eventually. But that's going to take some time. And I think in that bridge, as we seek to move away from fossil fuels, they are still going to be part of the mix. But I think the goal, and I think this is a united goal of everybody here at COP, is to eventually move away from that. But that's a decades-long process, and it's about starting now.
Right. Now, you specialize in Middle East politics, leadership, and security. What's the link? How do you bring all this together with climate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a lot of people think of national security, whether U.S. national security or Emirati national security or whatever country you're from, and think of, you know, military force, think of war, think of conflict, think of foreign policy. But the reality is now climate change more and more is driving national security issues. So across the board, we just had our conference, which I know we'll talk about in a second, and we spent a lot of time bringing forth experts from the United States, from our Department of Defense, to talk about the impact of climate change on naval bases and the fact that it means rising tide waters has actually caused serious problems for installations across the United States. The issues of hurricanes getting worse and worse. Can we have ships stationed where they've always traditionally been? Do we have to start to move them? Do we have to rethink how we have our naval forces actually arrayed, not just in the United States, but obviously throughout the world? The U.S. has a big military and a worldwide presence. All of those issues, I think, are coming into the question. We had another panel in which the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force talked about how we're literally changing all of our jets, our fighter planes, to be much more fuel efficient, which is obviously incredibly important and positive for the environment, but it's also incredibly good for the U.S. Less fuel means a lighter weight airplane, which means they may be able to go faster. There's a direct connection on a whole lot of these issues that I don't think has traditionally been explored, but it is becoming more and more something that people have to consider and think about.
What are some of the serious threats, in your opinion, when it comes to security of any given countries, given the resources that are related or tied into sustainability in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one is just a question of fuel. The reality is some countries, we're seeing this now, especially in Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the energy shortages that they have can affect their militaries.
The energy shortages that who has?
That the European countries have had, for instance. That you have to reprioritize resources. So if you have energy shortages and you have military requirements, do you have enough, frankly, fuel for your tanks, enough fuel for your planes? Do you have enough fuel for your forces? If you do, and you're able to take it from there, what we've seen were big concerns. Do you have enough fuel for your population? Do you have enough energy for your population? Because oil and natural gas have for so long been what sustained everybody's home heating in Europe and in the U.S. and every place that it gets cold. I think our European colleagues have seen that there was a real challenge, for instance, of being so reliant on Russian oil and gas. They've tried very, very quickly to change it, including with help from a number of partners here in the Middle East. But you've also seen a big kick for them to say that for our own domestic security, we can't do this anymore. We have to get to alternative climate options. We've got to talk about more wind power, more nuclear power, which for years there was a push against nuclear power, and now you're starting to see it come back into vogue. And so I think there's a direct connection there that's really starting to be felt much more acutely.
Why is it that we did see a lot of pushback against nuclear power? What's the main reason behind it? Is it because of what it sounds like, nuclear power? Is that pretty much it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, the reality is if there is a problem at a nuclear power plant, it can be catastrophic for not just 10 or 20 people, but for thousands upon thousands of people. We have seen historic examples of this.
Right.
Obviously, we saw it in Japan.
Fukushima.
In Fukushima, right. Exactly right.
Chernobyl?
Yep, Chernobyl, exactly.
Well, what's to prevent that from happening again?
Well, I don't think there's anything to prevent it. I mean, in terms of technology. Sometimes, there's a technological error, but usually it's human error. Usually,
right.
In Fukushima, you had a natural disaster that was not seen. The reality is Chernobyl was, frankly, human error, not insufficient monitoring. There are better processes now. There are better capabilities now. There's better awareness now. There's better expertise now of how to ensure that there's safety. And if you think about it compared to the number of nuclear power plants worldwide, it's actually been incredibly safe and one of the greener technologies that you can have. Do I think it's a long-term technology? No. If you can get to a technology, whether it's hydrogen or something else, in which the risk is even less, that if you had a nuclear power plant meltdown, you wouldn't have the issues that you did at Chernobyl, then of course that's a positive. But I think, like oil and gas, it's probably going to be something that for a transition period of the next 30, 40 years should be in the mix. It's going to have to be, even if we seek to eventually move away from it.
Right. Do you think we're actually making enough progress? And I'm only asking this because somebody asked me yesterday, he said, how do you gauge the progress that we're making when it comes to being more sustainable, more climate friendly? And it was a good question. How do you gauge it, in your opinion? Now, I know this is a bit away from your area of expertise, being security leadership, but in your personal opinion, how do we gauge if we're actually making progress, if we're making any headway here or not?
It is a good question because I think every country uses different metrics, and then there's obviously questions of international organizations are gauging it one way, individuals are frankly gauging it another way. I think the reality is, look, we're not seeing mean temperatures come down at the rates that we need them to. Obviously, that would be one important gauge. If we saw global mean temperatures drop in a meaningful way, if we saw the increase at which they're going up not go up as quickly, that would also be. There's measures of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's measures of sustainability that a number of organizations have put out.
Sorry to interrupt you, by the way, but also you just mentioned something which reminded me of another question from the same person, who clearly is on one end of the spectrum here, right? Asking me, well, what is the measure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Is it really a problem?
Yeah.
Is it a problem?
The honest answer is I don't know because I'm just not a scientist. I believe climate change is absolutely real. I believe it's man-made. The scientists who are experts tell me that it is a problem, and so I absolutely believe it's a problem. Now, I think the real question is, how much of a problem is it compared to all of the other issues related to climate change? And when you rack and stack them, when you try to prioritize what do we tackle first, or first, second, and third together, I think that's a question that it makes sense to me intellectually to prioritize carbon. But if somebody else said, look, you can get at carbon through also tackling other ways, sure. I think the question becomes really one of almost politics because the challenge is, for all of the work that I think we're doing here at COP, that a number of nations have undertaken, for all of the work the United States has done and that Secretary Kerry has emphasized, I think absolutely rightly, a lot of our European partners, Canadian partners, for some Latin American countries, the reality is you have in China, still, frankly. The biggest challenge, because if you don't get China on board and actually committed to the standards and means, it's going to be very, very hard to break through. Now, China's not alone. There's also challenges from other parts of the developing world, in the global south, Africa, India, others. But when it comes to international leadership on the issue, the reality becomes, how do we measure it? I'm coming from the world of security and politics. I measure it from, do we have alliances and do we have agreement, even with U.S. adversaries on this specific issue of climate change, in which we've come to political agreements to say, yes, for the good of all of humanity, we're going to make a concerted effort to actually have progress on climate change.
You said something interesting, getting China on board.
Yeah.
From a security and leadership perspective, do you think that's possible? If China was to realize that they have control over the resources needed to make this change, do you not think they would want to maybe pull back and say, no, we're okay? Or do you think they'll play ball?
No, I mean, look, I think it's a challenge. I think we've seen this being a challenge for the last decade, but I think there's a lot of things that influence this. Part of it is just a question of prioritization, including from, I'll take it from a U.S. perspective, American. I worked for the American government for a number of years. I think the challenge becomes for China, and for the U.S., I should say, vis-a-vis China, is what do you prioritize? In other words, is climate change the biggest thing that you need from China, or do you need China to work with you on Russia? Do you need China to work with you on human rights issues? Do you need China to work with you on conflicts in the Middle East? You're not going to be able to get everything. There is no relationship in which, especially adversaries, are going to be able to make a deal covering everything. And so I think it's a question of prioritization. But I do think for climate change specifically, there should be an opportunity to work together. It's really bad for China as well if climate change continues at this rate. I think the question is, historically it's been economic incentives have changed, and that's helped change behavior, or technology has changed to help push those economic incentives. Can we figure out a way to work together for better technology, even though we've been fighting about a lot of technological issues? Is technology a space where we can actually try to collaborate to impact climate change in a positive way and actually be beneficial economically for everybody? I don't know, but I think that's where you have to go with it. I think if it's just from a humanity perspective, I'm skeptical China's going to be willing to step into that gap and going to be willing to say, yes, we will do it as an altruistic measure solely from the goodness of our heart, just not my history with China. It's got to be in their own self-interest, and that way I think there are opportunities, but it's going to take a lot of years and really concerted effort of development to get them there.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't they also control a big portion of the resources in Africa when it comes to, I guess, the minerals or the main components required for EV batteries? Does that not say what we're talking about? I mean, that in advance, China's looking to take control of these resources. Yeah. Is that the case? I mean, is that pretty much what they're trying to do?
It is. I mean, look, I think China
How does China even gain access to that land in Africa?
So there's a couple of things. One is, what you were talking about is natural raw minerals, cobalt, lithium, others that are critical for everything from advanced battery technology to solar panel production.
But do you buy that land? Like, is that what it is?
Usually what happens is that you have development. So China for years has had what's called the Brick and Road Initiative, which is aimed at China, in theory, working with a number of countries, largely in Africa, but other places in the world, Southeast Asia as well, and saying we're going to invest bridges, roads, railways, lots of infrastructure. And then part of it is we're also going to help you develop your minds. We're going to help you develop these things. Now, historically, what the result has been is really, really bad for most of these African countries, for some of the Southeast Asian countries. Historically, what you've had as a result is China has gone in, taken the benefit from the mines, not actually given it to their populations, brought in their own people, not employed local people for both infrastructure, also for mining. And in turn, you've had multiple countries basically feel like at the end, when the resources were completely exploited, they were strip mined, Some of the infrastructure that was built 10 years ago is already crumbling. China leaves and says, we're out. There's nothing more here. And a lot of these countries are left in huge amounts of debt to China as part of this. I think that's starting to change a little bit. I think a number of countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, some of Latin America are getting a little wiser to this. It's not changing entirely. But yes, it's a huge challenge because it's really impacting, especially what you're saying, I think is absolutely right, in terms of China's monopoly over some of these resources and places is a huge challenge for the U.S. In fact, there's been a really big competition that, in Xinjiang, in the northwest of China, which for years has been home to a Muslim Chinese, ethnically Chinese population, that there's huge human rights abuses. There's been a question in the U.S. that has really started to percolate, which is, okay, well, what are you going to prioritize, human rights or the environment? Because this is where all the solar panels are coming from. Sure. So if we say no to all of this, are you not going to be able to get the solar panel production you need? If we say yes to it, then you're really undermining the human rights situation. It's a catch-22.
Catch-22.
But there are other countries that do have opportunities. We need to look toward them. So Australia has huge amounts of critical minerals, and we can work with our partners better. I have on my staff a young researcher, Alex Anigdi, who actually wrote a paper recently talking about the opportunity of the U.S. in Latin America to go after some of these critical minerals if we can actually enter into a partnership, and that we need to do it before China. So I think the U.S. is getting wiser to this, but because of U.S. politics, frankly, I don't think we're moving nearly as fast as we need to ensure our technology is not going to be subservient to Chinese dominance over critical minerals.
Okay. In closing, we have this Trends platform that they've given us. Any final words, any message you would like to put out to our viewers, listeners, the audience?
Well, look, the Atlantic Council and myself have been really privileged. We've had the opportunity now for 3 years to work with Trends Research and Advisory. This is our 3rd annual conference. It was the first time we've had it not in Washington, but here in the UAE. It was incredibly successful, and we're really, really excited about it, just because of the, frankly, participation in those that we were able to bring together and the expertise we were able to bring together. And that partnership has been really critical and important to us at the Atlantic Council. I also just think the reality is, a lot of people say, what is it that think tanks really do? And one of the things that we do is we bring together thought leadership like we did today in order to be able to eventually say to policymakers, no, here are some new ideas. Here's how, by having experts across a myriad of countries, a myriad of areas of expertise, here's how we're able to fundamentally say, here's other ideas that may not have been considered with our own, U.S. standards or Emirati standards that we're combining. And I think that combination of ideas, that combination of expertise really is powerful. It can help drive innovative opportunities and innovative ideas for policymakers as they're looking to try to figure out the right solutions for climate change, the right solutions for global warming, et cetera.
Jonathan, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks
really
for being
appreciate
here.
it.
Thanks.
Look forward to having you once again soon, hopefully.
Look forward to it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Once again, I'm your host, Omar, and this was another episode of Trending Echoes right here at COP28 in Dubai, and we'll see you in the next episode.